there's a question that almost nobody asks. Millions of people have watched Il Volo perform on the grandest stages in the world. Carnegie Hall, the Arena di Verona, the stages of Latin America, where audiences wept openly at the sound of three young Italians singing in voices that felt borrowed from another century. Millions have streamed their albums, shared their clips, called them a miracle. But very few of those people have ever stopped to ask the most important question of all. How did this actually happen? Because raw talent, no matter how extraordinary, does not build a global empire on its own. Someone had to see what others couldn't. Someone had to know which doors to open, which songs to choose, which moments to craft. And that someone, the architect standing just out of frame, was a man named Tony Renis. To understand what Renis brought to Il Volo, you first have to understand what Il Volo was before him. Three boys, three extraordinary voices, three teenagers from small Italian towns who had never met each other before a television talent show brought them together and changed all of their lives in a single broadcast. Piero Barone, from the sun-scorched hills of Sicily. Ignazio Boschetto, from the working-class warmth of Bologna. Gianluca Ginobili, from the rugged Adriatic coast of Roseto degli Abruzzi. Each of them had been singing since childhood, in the way that only truly gifted children sing. Not for applause, not for ambition, but because the music was already inside them and had to come out. When they appeared together on Ti lascio una canzone in 2009, the audience did not simply applaud. They gasped. You could hear it. Three boys, barely teenagers, producing operatic sound that seemed physically impossible for their age. But here's what the cameras didn't show. Here's what the highlight reels never captured. Being remarkable on a talent show and becoming a global force in music are two entirely different things. The Italian music industry had seen prodigies before. It had seen beautiful voices rise, dazzle briefly, and then quietly fade when the machinery of the business moved on to the next sensation. Talent alone had never been enough. What Il Volo needed, though they didn't know it yet, was a strategist. What they needed was someone who had lived inside the music industry long enough to understand not just what it celebrated, but what it remembered. Tony Renis was already a legend by the time he entered their story. Born Elio Cesari in Milan in 1938, Renis had spent decades operating at the highest levels of international music. As a singer, a songwriter, a producer, a bridge builder between the Italian tradition and the global mainstream. He had written songs that found homes in multiple languages. He had worked in Hollywood. He had connections that spanned continents and generations. And yet, for many Il Volo fans even today, his name barely registers. That invisibility is not an accident. It is, in many ways, the mark of a true maestro. Someone whose greatest work is the work that no one sees, because what they see instead is the finished masterpiece. When Renis became involved with Il Volo, he brought something that no vocal coach or record label executive could manufacture: a complete philosophy of what this trio could be. He understood instinctively that the classical crossover genre had been waiting for something it hadn't yet found. Not just operatic voices, but operatic voices attached to human stories, to emotional directness, to a sound that could move someone who had never once sat in an opera house. Andrea Bocelli had opened a door, Josh Groban had widened it, but Renis saw that Il Volo could walk through it in a way neither of those artists had, because they had something neither of those artists had. They were three. The interplay between the voices, the visual drama of three young men harmonizing at full power, the narrative possibility of a trio rather than a solo act, all of it could be shaped into something genuinely new. The transformation that followed was not a revolution. It was more precise than that. It was a calibration. Under Renis's influence, the song selections became deliberate in a way that went far beyond taste. Each piece had to do multiple things simultaneously: honor the classical tradition without becoming a museum exhibit, carry enough melodic familiarity to pull in listeners who didn't speak Italian, and serve as a vehicle for the specific emotional range each of the three voices possessed. Songs like O Sole Mio, Nessun Dorma, and Cor Ingrato were not chosen casually. They were chosen because they were load-bearing structures, works that could carry the full weight of operatic delivery while remaining accessible to ears that had never been trained to receive it. Renis knew the catalog. He knew which pieces had international DNA embedded in them, which melodies had already crossed borders and survived. But song selection was only the surface. Beneath it, Renis was working on something more fundamental, the emotional architecture of how Il Volo communicated. Opera has always been about feeling, but the operatic tradition had spent centuries constructing formal distance between the performer and the audience. What Renis pushed for, quietly, persistently, in the way that the most effective mentors always operate, was the collapse of that distance. He wanted audiences to feel as though these three young men were singing directly to them, not performing for them. The vocal direction that shaped their delivery in those early years carried that philosophy in every sustained note, every breath, every moment of dynamic restraint before a full-voiced release. You hear it when you listen carefully. There is an intimacy inside the power. That does not happen by accident. Then, there was the matter of identity. In an industry that often flattened artists into easily marketable categories, Renis understood that Il Volo's greatest commercial and artistic asset was precisely their refusal to be fully categorized. They were not a pop group. They were not a classical ensemble. They were not a nostalgia act. They were something that required the listener to expand their definitions. And that expansion, that slight cognitive and emotional stretch, was itself part of the appeal. The branding that emerged from this period was careful in ways that casual observers never noticed. The formal but youthful presentation, the balance between Italian cultural pride and international accessibility, the choice of venues that positioned them not as contestants or chart acts, but as artists of consequence. Renis had spent a career watching how perception shapes legacy. He applied everything he knew. The global breakthrough, when it came, looked from the outside like an overnight success story. The kind of thing music journalists love to package as the moment when the world discovered something magical. But those who knew the interior of that story understood it differently. The international tours, the performances for heads of state, the television appearances that introduced Il Volo to audiences across the Americas and Asia, the Grammy nomination that announced their arrival to an entirely new continent of listeners. None of it was accidental. It was the result of a strategic architecture built carefully over years, with Renis operating at its foundation. The scaffolding was invisible. The building was magnificent. What makes this story genuinely complicated and genuinely worth examining is that most of the people who love Il Volo most deeply have no clear picture of how much of what they love was constructed in those formative years under his guidance. The fans who stood at the Arena di Verona and felt something move in their chest when the three voices united on a sustained high note, they experienced something real. That experience belongs to them completely. But the pathway to that moment, the chain of decisions and directions and philosophical commitments that made that moment possible, runs directly through a man most of them have never thought to research. There is something almost poetic about that invisibility. The best architects are often the ones whose buildings everyone loves and whose names nobody knows. His influence did not end when the training wheels came off. It doesn't work that way with the deepest kinds of mentorship. What Renis built into Il Volo in those early years was not a set of rules, but a set of instincts, a way of approaching repertoire, a way of inhabiting a song rather than merely executing it, a way of understanding what an international audience needs to feel rather than just hear. Those instincts are still present in their work. You hear them in the way Piero approaches a climactic phrase, in the way Ignazio finds warmth in a line that another singer would make cold. in the way Gianluca's lower register creates gravity beneath the melodic architecture of a performance. The fingerprints are subtle, but they are there. Great careers in music, the ones that endure across decades and generations, are almost never the product of talent alone. They are the product of talent meeting vision at precisely the right moment. And vision requires a visionary. Il Volo had the voices. They had the faces, the youth, the chemistry, the raw material of something extraordinary. What Tony Renis gave them was the map, the knowledge of how to transform extraordinary raw material into a legacy that would outlast any single performance, any single chart position, any single year. He gave them a philosophy. And if you listen closely to every note they have ever sung on a world stage, you can still hear it breathing underneath everything. The quiet, permanent imprint of the maestro who knew, before almost anyone else did, exactly what this was going to become.